The starting point for this research, which is in progress, is sort of an often taken for granted nature of wind turbine technology itself. So that's why that's where we got the title "Size Matters." So, is that shifting to the next slide?
There you go.
Okay, right. Yeah, it's just, so yeah, as many of you I'm sure know, wind turbine technology has drastically increased in size over the past few decades. Early models in Denmark were as small as 10 kilowatts and 40-70 meters in height. Nowadays, they're up to 10 megawatts and over 200 meters, and even today, some companies are aiming for 15 megawatt turbines. So there's been a drastic increase in size in turbine technology throughout the decades. Here's a visual representation of that process. So that's really quite a good illustration of the real scale of changes. However, the size does matter in some respects. In terms of social acceptance, the visual impacts of the scale of turbines is sort of a thing that you see coming up again and again. Giant turbines, monster turbines. These sort of terms are used by opponents, and it's related to to literature on technology place fit. And one could also ask whether whether it's the size itself, or is the size sort of seen as a proxy for something else, as sort of an injustice in how the landscape is used and who decides on the landscape, or the industrialization of the landscape, which also relates to trust, which is a key issue in social acceptance. Recent literature has also flagged the relevance of the scale of turbines for energy democracy and participation in the energy transition. The increasing capital costs of these turbines means that communities and small-scale producers find it increasingly difficult to finance and to set up their own projects, which impacts the possibility for distributed generation scenarios and more community energy. The dominant narrative for these changes in scale is greater efficiency, the ability to use new locations like offshore, reducing the levelized cost of energy, and the competitiveness with other technologies, and also the need for climate change mitigation in more recent decades has been a push, and the need to ramp up renewable energy production. So this is the dominant narrative, and our research isn't really attempting to discredit this narrative in a sense, but to maybe dig beneath it a little bit, and to also try to identify what other drivers might be there behind the scenes. To do this, we're drawing on literature from science and technology studies, which is quite a broad field. But one of the underlying assumptions of that field is that science and technology is inherently political and value-laden, and it collapses this distinction between science as a value-free or neutral realm. One of the more well-known strands of literature in SCS is the co-production, and it takes this assumption that science is always political and value-laden, and argues that therefore, if science and technology is to serve humanity, we need more democratic or deliberative approaches to science and technology, and it draws on literature from deliberative democracy, and that more recent literature in the broad STS has also drawn attention to more what one might call structural or political economic factors. That's David Teufeld and what he calls a cultural political economy of research and innovation, which is a mouthful, but yeah, it seemed to build on this work which within the STS field. The use of this theory and social science technology studies is it prompts an opening the black box of turbine technology, which is often taken for granted, and leads us to ask questions such as, what is the problem to be assumed by technological innovation? Who defines this problem? What strategies are assumed to overcome this problem? And what framings and problem definitions are left out of this picture? So that's what we're essentially trying to do. There has been some research from the STS, the broad STS field and critical social science in terms of wind turbine technology innovation. A lot of this has been quite focused on the role of agency and on different actors and different institutions and their particular roles. An early paper by Grood and Cronin used the terms of breakthrough and bricolage, and they argue that in the US, where there was this sort of breakthrough model where utilities and scientists were trying to, from the outset, develop larger and larger turbines. This was in contrast with the Danish model, which was more a pragmatic approach, focusing on smaller turbines and making them essentially work in the first place. And this Danish model essentially prevailed. Following on from this, Hendry and Harbone argued that this Danish model of bricolage did prevail, but only up to a certain point, where there was a reassertion of this breakthrough or science-based research and development model of wind turbine design, which pushed for large increases in scale in turbine technology. So that's sort of the backdrop in the literature, and Hendry and Harbone also conclude that point towards potential other factors that maybe are not considered from an agent's perspective or from cognitive perspective, and they say that we should also look at objective factors such as economic and organizational factors. So that's really what we're trying to do. In terms of potential structural explanations for this increase in size, there are a few which we've sort of initially identified. For example, the political influence of centralized utility operators and centralized energy systems, as well as commercial actors, as well as different channels for participation in energy systems and the relative role that different actors and actor groups are given, and the power they're given in research and development and in technology design. Additionally, the turbine industry as an accumulation strategy, or as a manufacturing strategy, and also more recently as a patent seeking strategy, could also have effects on how the technology has developed over the years. And related to these are ideological, which are also related to, I suppose, cognitive factors in the previous literature, but maybe more explicitly links these factors to these broader political economic structures. And I'll pass over to Alex now.
All right, can you hear me? I'm just getting my camera to boot up here. It should be coming up in a moment. So Rob, I'll get you to advance the slides when I'm going through them. So our central research question, the kind of core fundamental question behind, because there's the surface level option of looking at, there's why are turbines getting larger over time, and there are a lot of more direct kind of technical explanations, but I think the more interesting thing is to look at what are the underlying forces that are pushing these changes in the industry. And so our fundamental research question is looking at the development of wind energy turbine technology and how has the design and how has the change in design over time been influenced by political, economic, and ideological factors as kind of those structural factors that Rob has just laid out. So next slide, please.
Sorry, that should be changing now. Okay, sorry.
Yeah, okay, thank you. And so our primary research focus is looking at Denmark as a case study. And the reason we chose Denmark is because it's kind of seen as this global center of the green division of labor for wind energy, and kind of widely recognized as a significant player in the role of early wind energy innovation and kind of the adoption of large-scale turbines over time as well. Looking at it as kind of a leader in these various different benchmarks for success in the innovation of wind energy. Looking at wind turbine patterns, they're leading the world, or patents. Wind power integration into the electrical system, they're leading the world. I think if you talk to anyone who's not in kind of the field of renewable energy, even it's quite widely known that Denmark is a leader on the world scale for this. As well as it has an interesting history in terms of the evolution of the wind power sector and the relationship with community-based wind power development and cooperatives in its early stages, and then this kind of broad evolution towards more large-scale, utility-scale wind energy deployment, and how that has changed over time, I think is going to be quite an interesting area of focus. Next slide, please, Rob. So methodologically, we're taking a qualitative approach, and our primary focus are these two methods of policy analysis and key informant interviews. So our current undertaking right now is going through the various kind of policy documents of relevance. And for this, we're looking at both the national Danish level, but also at the EU level. We've been kind of noticing that there's been quite a lot of influence from the EU level, especially in recent years, for kind of pushes towards competitiveness and liberalization of markets. And there's some interesting questions to be asked as to what those kind of pushes from the EU level have meant for the way in which wind turbine technology is being developed in Denmark. We're looking at research and innovation policy documents primarily, as well as like kind of the fundamental structuring of research funding calls, and how these kind of set the tone for researchers and engineers and scientists working in the field. And then from this, we're going into key informant interviews, and we're hoping to speak with scientists, policymakers, various experts in the field, as well as people in the industry. And we've already begun doing some kind of scoping interviews, interviewing a couple relatively prominent colleagues in Denmark, and we've got off to a good start already. Next slide, please. So some of our initial findings, and of course these are indicative because we are still early on in the research phase, but we've been identifying trends such as the kind of iterative processes of technological development, moving from small-scale experimentation and optimization, eventually moving towards larger turbine capacity, and this has kind of been a trend for quite a long time. I think there's been an interest in maybe initially just in the technical side of things as to what is the largest turbine we can build technically, and then later on we have these kind of actual economic and kind of political support that may actually allow for these turbines to be deployed. We're seeing different competing agendas, such as the potential conflict between industrial policy and the actual intent of growing a industry. In Denmark, there's quite a clear example of them seeking to develop wind turbine technology as a export industry, compared to the political requirements for the utilities to actually introduce wind energy and implement it in their own grid. As well as these kind of potential disconnects between the scientists and engineers who are advancing wind turbine innovation and the potential effects these may have on local communities, sort of as we referenced with the social acceptance literature, saying that, you know, it may be well and good to have the largest turbine possible, but is that always appropriate for the communities which are going to be hosting these technologies? as well as you have these kind of economic or financial drivers that may be pushing the evolution of wind turbine technology, and seeing the feed-in tariffs incentivizing larger turbines, as well as this kind of consistent underlying thread of cost efficiency and the levelized cost of energy as being kind of the primary determinant of what is a successful wind energy turbine. And then at the EU context, we're seeing kind of these examples of the set plans and the various research frameworks that are being set out, and how do they embody the need for economic competitiveness, and how do these kind of support this push towards market liberalization that we've been seeing. And now we're seeing examples of research projects which are pushing turbines up to 15 megawatts, and the kind of implications those have on some of those questions around social acceptance that we've identified is quite interesting. Next slide, please, Rob. So as Rob's already commented at, our contributions are to the critical social acceptance literature. And I think there's going to be value derived from this, in that we're really digging into turbine technology, not just as kind of a neutral, taken for granted issue within the broader context of wind energy, but actually is like an active component of social acceptance, and looking at how these kind of the manifestation of power in the evolution of wind turbine technology kind of demonstrates the various ways in which it's been influenced by these different underlying factors. This also kind of allows us to link with the co-production concept in science and technology studies, and also connected to the distributed generation literature that's evolving. And this is going to complement the literature on wind turbine evolution, and looking at kind of the agency and cognitive frames, which Rob was able to summarize earlier from Garud and Carnot and Hendry and Harbone, and looking at not just technology evolution as a neutral force, but what are the what's the role of agency within these.